I think it might be worth us flipping to the beginning of Philemon, because we started to touch on some of the terminology there that's also kind of rich, and let's just, for fun, look at that text and think about what it is that you're noticing emerging there, because we do get some different terminology than we're getting in other letters, and we have the advantage of having such a super short letter that kind of contains so much.
I would just note again, I think that I'm fascinated by his title of decimos, or prisoner or captive of Christ Jesus, specifically because it seems that in the body of the letter, Paul is referring to his imprisonment, that he's actually in prison while he's writing this letter, or at least he has been in prison recently. In some of the other letters, when Paul is calling himself a slave to Christ Jesus, we don't get the sense that he means that he is literally enslaved in some sort of relationship with Christ Jesus. Whereas here, when he's identifying as a prisoner of Christ Jesus, it seems to correlate somehow with the fact he is also physically imprisoned, perhaps relating to something that he did with respect to this person, Christ Jesus. So the sort of, I noted earlier the shift between where in many of the other letters we're talking about Paul as the slave to Christ. Here we have Paul as the prisoner to Christ, and that sort of seems to be a meaningful difference. On top of that, I think it's meaningful that he is actually referring to a sort of physical condition he is in right now, as opposed to a metaphorical condition like being a slave to Christ, and as opposed to being an apostle, which could be a metaphorical condition. It could be a title. There are a lot of other sorts of ways to read apostle, but I think prisoner is almost unique amongst some of the other prescripts, given the situation that Paul seems to be in when he's composing this letter.
I just think of the range of referential words with the people that he's greeting. So you have kind of the co-worker language, which we've seen for Philemon, and then you have the familial language with Aphia, and then Archipo is greeted as a sustratiote, a fellow soldier, and I find that it's a military reference as well. So you have familial references, military references, and kind of co-worker references, all smushed together into the greeting of these different individuals.
Also, we tend to think that the letter of Paul to Philemon is a private letter of Paul to one individual, Philemon, but apparently the greeting section includes other individual names. Also, the ecclesia in your church, and if we read the rest of the letters, it's more clear in Greek, but the second pronoun you, the Greek word which translated into second pronoun you in English is singular, verses 4 through 21. So the whole case is made toward the individual, presumably Philemon, but still this letter is functioned as a kind of public correspondence as well as a private letter between one person and another. So that makes us to think about what's the role of Pauline letters within the community of people as well as personal letters.
Knowing Greek doesn't solve our problems. It doesn't mean that we can find the one true meaning of the text, but this is a moment where both Greg and Chansok in particular, and Jennifer, by reminding us of this term, sistratioti, that's used, are sort of reminding us that things are a bit complicated. So let me just go back and kind of review what the complexity is. The first complexity that Greg raised is that if we read in Greek, at the beginning of Philemon, what we get is Paulos desmios Christou Isu, right? Paul, prisoner or captive. And then the construction in Greek is called the genitive, and it just means that it sort of is an of statement, but it could also be translated for, as it is here in the RSV. So what Greg was pointing out is all the times that we have Pavlos doulos, Christu Isu, right? The same construction. It's always Paul, slave of Christ Jesus. Here it becomes Paul, prisoner or captive for Christ Jesus, a more literal historical event in his life than slavery. And that's an interesting choice. What would it mean if it's just a prisoner of, Christ Jesus? How do we know when to make this a reference to a historical event? We do know that in 1 Corinthians, Paul talks about himself as fighting wild beasts. We do know that in Philippians, he talks about himself as being in the Praetorion, sort of in the Roman magistrate, being called up before that. And of course, by the time Paul's story is told by Acts, we've got Paul in prison a lot, in the kind of stories about Paul's life written in the 2nd century. But it's an interesting question here. The second thing that we're noticing that Chansak was raising is that Paul in the prescript sort of expands outwards, right, to all these different people, and to Philemon, not just our fellow worker, but our beloved fellow worker. We can wonder how much of an emphasis was sort of put on that in a letter in which he's really asking for something from Philemon. And then it sort of broadens out. We can imagine these other people gathering with these terms that we want to think about. What does it mean to call someone your sister in the sort of kinship language that early Christians used, that these first communities in Christ used? Or fellow soldier, what is the valence of that terminology when Paul sometimes talks about putting on the armor of Christ or presenting a breastplate of a certain sort? What kind of metaphorical or real language is going on here? Metaphorical, I think. And then, as Chansak was saying, the letter itself, the body of the letter, settles down into the first person singular, the second person singular, right? The you, which we can't read in English because we don't have terminology that shows us whether it's plural or singular, but is here. And so too, in some of the letters where it's very clear that there's a co-authorship, nonetheless an I, a first person, sort of emerges at certain points in the letter. So when we call these the letters of Paul, it's in part because we feel the force of that I emerging at various points.